It was a typical route, one I had driven countless times before. The desert stretches out endlessly, a vast expanse of sand and rock with nothing but the open sky above. It was around midnight, the air cool and the stars shining brightly. I was making good time, the hum of the truck engine the only sound breaking the silence. That's when I saw him, a figure standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched in the universal sign for hitchhiking. Normally I don't pick up hitchhikers, it's against company policy and just not safe. But something about this guy made me slow down. He looked harmless enough, a young man in his early 20s wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Where you headed, buddy?" I asked. He leaned in, a look of relief washing over his face. "Just to the next town," he said. "There's a diner there. Can you drop me off?" I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat and I started driving again. His name was Mark, he told me. He had a quiet, soft-spoken manner and he didn't offer much information about himself. I didn't pry. We drove in silence for a while, the road stretching out endlessly in front of us. I glanced over at him occasionally. He seemed distant, lost in thought. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but there was something off about his expression. Finally, we reached the outskirts of the next town. The lights of the diner came into view, a small oasis of warmth and light in the darkness. I pulled into the parking lot and turned to tell Mark we had arrived, but the passenger seat was empty. I stared at the seat in disbelief, my heart pounding. There was no way he could have gotten out without me noticing. The truck was still moving when I glanced over just a few moments ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. Shaken, I decided to go into the diner. Maybe someone inside had seen him, or maybe he had somehow gotten out and walked in without me noticing. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The diner was nearly empty, just a few late-night customers scattered around. I walked up to the counter and asked the waitress if she had seen a young man matching Mark's description come in. She shook her head. "No, I haven't seen anyone like that tonight. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. A missing persons flyer pinned to the bulletin board near the door. The face on the flyer was Mark's. I felt a jolt of shock. The flyer was dated 2 years ago. I stood there, staring at the flyer, my mind racing. How could Mark be missing for 2 years? I had just picked him up on the side of the road. It didn't make any sense. I got back into my truck and drove to the truck stop where I planned to spend the night. I couldn't stop thinking about Mark and his eerie disappearance. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to find some logical explanation, but there was none. It was like something out of a horror movie. The next day I went to the local police station and told them what had happened. They listened patiently, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They probably thought I was just another trucker with a wild story, but I knew what I had seen. Mark was real. I had picked him up, talked to him, and then he had vanished. And his face on that missing persons flyer, it was burned into my memory. I finished my route and went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I got back on the road, I found myself looking for hitchhikers, half expecting to see Mark standing there again. I was driving the same route again, late at night. The desert stretched out before me, the same as it had that night, and there, standing by the side of the road, was Mark. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. I stared at him, not believing my eyes. It was him, the same pale face, the same tired look. He was standing in the exact same spot where I had picked him up before. I sat there for a moment, my mind racing. What was going on? Was I losing my mind? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to drive away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but another part of me needed answers. I rolled down the window. "Mark?" I called out. He turned to look at me, his eyes empty and distant. He didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Get in," I said. He climbed into the passenger seat just like before. We started driving, and the silence was even more oppressive this time. I glanced over at him, trying to read his expression, but he was like a statue, unmoving and unreadable. We drove for a while, and I was too afraid to speak. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Where have you been?" I asked. "You disappeared that night. What happened to you?" He turned to look at me, his eyes cold and lifeless. "I don't know," he said. "I just need to get to the diner." I nodded, my mind racing. Something was seriously wrong here. This wasn't normal. I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. We reached the diner and I pulled into the parking lot. I turned to tell Mark we had arrived, but once again he was gone. I stared at the empty seat, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. It was like some kind of nightmare. I got out of the truck and walked around it, looking for any sign of him. Nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I went into the diner, my mind in a fog. The same waitress was working, and she gave me a concerned look as I walked in. "Are you okay?" she asked. I shook my head, unable to speak. I walked over to the bulletin board and looked at the missing persons flyer. Mark's face stared back at me, the same haunted expression. The date was still 2 years ago. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be made. It was like I was trapped in some kind of twisted reality where nothing made sense. I left the diner and got back into my truck. I didn't know what else to do. I drove to the truck stop and tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. I kept replaying the events of the night over and over, trying to find some logical explanation, but there was none. The next day, I went back to the police station and told them what had happened. They listened patiently, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They probably thought I was just another trucker with a wild story. But I knew what I had seen. Mark was real. I had picked him up, talked to him, and then he had vanished. And his face on that missing persons flyer, it was burned into my memory. I finished my route and went home, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I got back on the road, I found myself looking for hitchhikers, half expecting to see Mark standing there again. Months went by, and the memory of that night started to fade. I told myself it was just a weird, unexplainable event and tried to move on. But then something happened that brought it all back. I was driving the same route again, late at night. The desert stretched out before me the same as it had that night, and there, standing by the side of the road, was Mark. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. I stared at him, not believing my eyes. It was him, the same pale face, the same tired look. He was standing in the exact same spot where I'd picked him up before. I sat there for a moment, my mind racing. What was going on? Was I losing my mind? I didn't know what to do. I rolled down the window and called out, "Mark?" He turned, his eyes empty, just like before. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Get in," I said, my voice trembling. He climbed into the passenger seat, silent. We drove to the diner, and just as before, he vanished when we arrived. I walked inside, feeling numb. The waitress looked at me with pity. "You okay?" she asked. I shook my head. "I don't know." I glanced at the flyer again. Mark's face stared back, forever missing. I left, the weight of the unexplainable heavy on my mind. I had been on the road for hours, my thumb out, hoping someone would stop and give me a ride. It was getting late, and I knew I had to make it home before midnight. The sky was already dark, and the only light came from the occasional passing cars and the distant glow of street lamps. Just when I thought no one would stop, a large truck slowed down and pulled over. The driver rolled down his window and looked at me. He was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a weary expression. "Need a lift?" he asked. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, opening the door and climbing in. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You know, it's dangerous to hitchhike at night." "Yeah, I know," I replied, but I didn't have much of a choice. He glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "Ever heard of the Midnight Ripper?" I shook my head. "No, who's that?" The driver sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "He's a serial killer, targets hitchhikers, especially those out alone at night. They say he strikes around midnight, leaving his victims in the woods." I felt a chill run down my spine. That's pretty creepy. "Yeah," the driver said, his voice low. "They never caught him. Some say he's still out there looking for his next victim." I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. "Why are you telling me this?" The driver didn't answer right away, he just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road. "I thought you should know," he finally said, "in case you ever find yourself out here again." We rode in silence for a while longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the driver. His story about the Midnight Ripper was unsettling, but it was the way he told it that bothered me the most. There was something in his voice, something that made my skin crawl. As we drove, the road grew more desolate. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches forming a dark tunnel. The driver slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. "Why are we stopping?" I asked, my heart pounding. The driver turned to me, his eyes cold and hard. "I need to take a leak. Stay here." He climbed out of the cab and disappeared into the trees. I watched him go, my mind racing. Something about this whole situation didn't feel right. I glanced around the cab, looking for anything that might give me a clue about who this guy really was. That's when I saw it. Under the seat, barely visible in the dim light, was a knife. A large, blood-stained knife. Panic surged through me. I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. I grabbed the knife and bolted from the truck, running into the woods. The branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear the driver shouting behind me, his voice growing fainter as I ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just kept running, the knife clutched tightly in my hand. Eventually I stumbled upon a small clearing and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. I knew I couldn't stay there long. I had to keep moving, had to find help. But the woods were vast, and I had no idea where I was. I listened for any signs of the driver, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. I forced myself to get up and keep moving, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I didn't know how long I walked, but it felt like hours. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound made my heart race. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw a light in the distance. A small cabin, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. I stumbled towards it, praying that someone was home. "Help! Please, someone help me!" The door creaked open and an elderly man peered out. The old man helped me inside and locked the door. He gave me some water and a blanket, and I told him everything. He listened quietly, his expression growing more concerned with every word. "We need to call the police," he said once I finished my story. "You stay here, I'll get the phone." He left the room, and I sat there, trembling. As I sat there, waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a terrible fate. The driver's face, his cold eyes, haunted me. I knew I would never forget that night, and the fear that had gripped me so tightly. When the police arrived, they took my statement and searched the area for the driver. They found his truck abandoned on the side of the road, but there was no sign of him. The knife, still stained with blood, was the only evidence they had. I returned home, shaken but grateful to be alive. I told my family what had happened, and they were horrified. They couldn't believe that something so terrible had nearly happened to me. In the weeks that followed, I tried to put the incident behind me, but it was difficult. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the driver's face, heard his chilling words. The Midnight Ripper was still out there, and I couldn't help but wonder how many others had fallen into his trap. I started seeing a therapist to help me cope with the trauma. Talking about it helped, but the fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I avoided the roads at night, never wanting to take the risk again. One day, a detective came to see me. He said they had found new evidence, something that might help them catch the driver. They had discovered a hidden compartment in his truck, filled with photographs of his victims. It was chilling to think that I had been so close to such evil. The detective assured me that they were doing everything they could to track him down, but I knew it would never be enough to make me feel completely safe. I was on a road trip, driving through a state I had never been to before when my car decided to give up. It was late afternoon, and I was on a quiet stretch of road, miles away from any town. I tried everything I knew to get the car running again, but nothing worked. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen another car for hours. I was stuck. After what felt like forever, a beat-up old truck came rumbling down the road. I stuck out my thumb and hoped for the best. The truck pulled over and a scruffy man leaned out the window. He had a grizzled beard, unkempt hair, and a look in his eye that made me uneasy, but I didn't have any other options. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah, my car broke down," I said. "I could really use a ride to the nearest town." He nodded. "Hop in." I hesitated for a moment but climbed into the passenger seat. The inside of the truck smelled like old cigarettes and sweat. The man introduced himself as Carl. We drove in silence for a while, and I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread in my gut. After about half an hour, Carl suddenly turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt track. The trees closed in around us, and the daylight started to fade. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Shortcut," he grunted. "Road up ahead's washed out. This'll get us there quicker." My gut told me something was wrong, but I didn't have any other options. After a while, we pulled up to a rusty old cabin in the middle of the woods. Carl turned off the engine and got out. "Come on," he said, "need to grab something from inside." I stayed in the truck, watching as he disappeared into the cabin. The seconds ticked by, and my anxiety grew. Then I saw him come back out holding a large knife. My heart started pounding, and I knew I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I bolted from the truck and ran into the woods. I could hear Carl shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running. The woods were dark and the underbrush was thick, but I didn't stop. I tripped and stumbled, my heart racing, my breath coming in gasps. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to keep moving. I spent the night in those woods, too scared to move. Every sound made me jump. I imagined Carl creeping through the trees, knife in hand, searching for me. The darkness seemed to go on forever. I was cold, hungry, and terrified, but I forced myself to stay quiet and still. When dawn finally broke, I started moving again, carefully making my way back to the main road. It took hours and I was exhausted, but I finally made it. The sun was rising and the road was empty. I started walking, hoping to find help. Eventually a car came along and the driver was kind enough to give me a lift to the nearest town. I told them what had happened and they called the police. I gave my statement, but they never found Carl or the cabin. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The memory of that night still haunts me. I can still see Carl's cold dead eyes and the glint of the knife in his hand. I don't know what he had planned, and I don't want to know. I just thank my lucky stars that I managed to get away. A few months after that night, I was still shaken but trying to get back to normal. I had a new car, a new job, and I was doing my best to put the whole thing behind me. But sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could still see those woods, dark and suffocating, and Carl's menacing figure. One evening I was driving home from work when I noticed a car following me. At first I thought I was just being paranoid, but the car kept turning the same way I did, staying just a little too close. My heart rate picked up, and my hands started to sweat on the steering wheel. I made a few more turns, trying to shake the feeling, but the car stayed with me. I decided to take a detour, heading down some side streets to see if they would follow. They did. Panic set in. I remembered Carl's truck, the way he had turned off the main road without warning. I couldn't let this happen again. I drove towards a busy part of town, hoping to lose them in the traffic. The streets were crowded with people and cars, and I felt a little safer. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, the car was still there. A few days later I found a note on my car. It was just a scrap of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My heart sank as I read it. "You can't hide forever," it said in shaky, handwritten letters. I felt like I was losing my mind. I started looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. I avoided going out at night and stuck to crowded places whenever I could. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I knew someone was out there, waiting for the right moment. One night, I was lying in bed trying to sleep when I heard a noise outside. It was just a faint rustling, but it set my nerves on edge. I got up and peeked out the window. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a shadow moving in the yard. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my phone and called the police. The officers arrived quickly and searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. They told me it was probably just an animal, but I knew better. Someone had been out there, watching me. I installed security cameras around my house and changed all the locks. I barely slept, constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't live like this forever, but I didn't know what else to do. Then one night I heard a loud crash outside. I jumped out of bed and looked out the window. One of my security cameras had been smashed, the wires hanging loose. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, my hands shaking. They searched the yard and found footprints leading away from the house, disappearing into the woods behind my property. They promised to keep an eye on the area and patrol more frequently, but it didn't make me feel much better. I knew whoever was out there would be back. The days that followed were tense. I couldn't focus on anything, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every little sound. I had to get out of there, but I didn't know where to go. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage. One evening, I decided to go for a drive to clear my head. I needed to get away, even if just for a little while. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally headed back home, I felt a little better, like maybe I could start to move on. But as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The front door was open, the lock broken. I knew I had locked it before I left. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling. The police arrived quickly and searched the house. They found nothing missing, but the sense of violation was overwhelming. Someone had been in my home, going through my things. They hadn't taken anything, but it felt like a message. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend. I told them everything, and they were supportive, but I could see the worry in their eyes. They didn't know how to help me, and neither did I. I was driving back from visiting a friend in a nearby town and it was getting late. I was tired, just wanting to get home and crash. But then I saw him, standing on the side of the road, thumb out, drenched in the downpour. He looked pretty harmless. Just a young guy, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a backpack and a soaked hoodie. He looked cold and desperate. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and rolled down the window a bit. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He nodded quickly, looking relieved. Yeah, thanks man, just trying to get to a friend's place. It's not far. I unlocked the passenger door and he hopped in, shivering a little. He looked over at me with a grateful smile. Thanks again. I pulled back onto the road, feeling a little uneasy but trying not to show it. I'd heard all the stories about picking up strangers, but this guy seemed harmless enough. We drove in silence for a bit, the sound of the rain on the roof and the windshield wipers, the only noise. Jack seemed nice enough, though. We talked a little about the weather, where we were from, that sort of thing. He was from a small town nearby, visiting a friend who lived out in the woods. Said he didn't have a car and was hoping to get there before it got too late. After a while, Jack asked if I could take a detour. He said his friend lived off the main road and it would be a bit of a drive through the woods. I hesitated. The idea of driving deeper into the forest, especially at night, didn't sit well with me. But Jack seemed anxious and I didn't want to leave him stranded. Against my better judgment, I agreed. As we turned off the main road and onto a narrow, winding dirt path, my unease grew. The woods were dark and dense, the rain making everything slick and muddy. Jack kept giving me directions, guiding me deeper into the forest. Finally, we reached a small clearing. Jack pointed ahead, where a faint light flickered in the distance. That's the place, he said. Just drop me off here, and I'll walk the rest of the way. I stopped the car, and Jack got out. He turned back to me, looking a bit uncertain. Thanks again, Mike. I owe you one. He gave me a small wave and started walking towards the light. I watched him go, feeling an odd sense of relief and anxiety at the same time. As I sat there, debating what to do, I noticed movement in the trees. An older man, looking disheveled and wild-eyed, stumbled out of the woods. He looked terrified, his eyes darting around as if he were being chased. He ran up to the car, banging on the window. "Help me, please!" he begged. "You have to get me out of here!" I was frozen, unsure of what to do. The man looked desperate and his panic was contagious. I glanced in the direction Jack had gone, but he was out of sight. The older man kept pleading, his voice rising in fear. "Please, he's going to come back. You have to help me." Before I could react, Jack reappeared, his face twisted in anger. He stormed up to the older man, shouting, "What the hell are you doing here?" he yelled. "I told you to stay away." The older man backed away, fear evident in his eyes. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to be part of it. I started the car, my hands shaking. Jack climbed in, slamming the door. The older man stood there, watching us with a desperate look. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror, still standing in the clearing, looking lost and terrified. The ride back to the main road was silent. Jack didn't say a word, and I didn't dare ask any questions. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that man? Why was Jack so angry? And why did I feel like I had just escaped something terrible? When we finally reached the main road, Jack asked me to drop him off at a rundown house on the outskirts of a small town. The house looked abandoned, with broken windows and overgrown weeds. Jack got out without a word, giving me a final, tense look. "Thanks for the ride," he muttered, then disappeared into the darkness. I drove away, my heart pounding. The whole encounter left me feeling unsettled and disturbed. I couldn't shake the image of the older man's terrified face, or the way Jack had reacted. There were so many questions, and I knew I'd never get answers. As I pulled into my driveway, I tried to put the night behind me, but the memory lingered, a nagging feeling that something was wrong, that I'd narrowly avoided something dangerous. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been part of something sinister, something I couldn't understand. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I found myself replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of them. I even considered going back to that clearing to see if I could find any clues, but the thought of returning there filled me with dread. Eventually, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was just a strange encounter, nothing more. But every now and then I'd catch myself thinking about Jack and the older man, wondering what had really happened that night in the woods. It wasn't until weeks later that I heard something on the news that made my blood run cold. There had been a series of disappearances in the area, people going missing near the woods. The authorities had found a campsite in the forest with evidence of someone living there for a long time. They suspected foul play, but there were no leads, no clues as to who was behind it.